today. I am really excited to be here. My name is Bryna Griffin. I'm the head of the Birdlife Forest Program. And we're really excited to be co-organizing this session with Wildlife Conservation Society. So the focus of today's session is REDD and ARR, or in other words, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, and afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation. So these are relatively young, but hugely important parts of the emerging carbon market. And a number of other sessions over the course of today and yesterday are looking at things like the quality of carbon credits and the carbon markets in general. So for today's panel, we're really focusing on pretty narrowly on the development of REDD and ARR projects from the project development point of view. And so we'll be talking about some of the sort of nuts and bolts of project development. And we're hoping to get to things that may be missed when we're talking about broader sort of market issues and climate policy issues, as well as things that we hope will be useful for buyers and investors who are interested in these projects to really understand the projects and how they work. So to kick us off, I'd like our panel to introduce themselves. I'm going to go alphabetically. If you guys could just tell us who you are, who you work for, and a little bit about your and your organization's involvement in REDD and ARR, that would be great. So Brian, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Williams. I'm the Regional Director of Asia for Wildlife Works Carbon. And our company is global, so we work throughout Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And we're a private company that focuses on working with communities and doing REDD+ projects. Our first project was in Kenya. It's called the Kasagawa Corridor REDD+ project, and it was one of the first projects that was verified under the Verra BCS standard. And we used a methodology called VM0009 that our company developed. So this was roughly 10 years ago now. And that's, I think, the main parts of Wildlife Works and myself. Thank you for having us, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
Great, thanks, Brian. Jenny, I'm going to jump to you.
Thanks, Bryna. Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Henman. I'm the chairman and founder of Plant Your Future. And Plant Your Future is a nonprofit working in the Peruvian Amazon. We work with smallholder communities to implement agroforestry, planting a mixture of native fruit trees and timber trees alongside other crops. I've personally come from a 17-year background working in natural climate solutions. I was actually inspired to set up Plant Your Future on the back of my master's work in the Peruvian Amazon. Very excited to join the panel today, and I'm really bringing the perspectives of Plant Your Future as a grassroots carbon project developer. Our project is registered under the Verified Carbon Standard and CCB as well as an ARR project. And yeah, just looking forward to sharing perspectives with the panel and questions.
Great, thanks. Manuel? You're on mute.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Manuel Estrada. I'm the Innovations Director at Verra. Verra is a non-for-profit NGO created in 2007 that develops and manages standards for a number of issues related to sustainable development and environment, with the idea of, or the goal of bringing finance to address all of these most challenging issues facing the environment today. Well, I personally started working on climate change issues in 1996. I negotiated for Mexico the Clean Development Mechanism and REDD under the UNFCCC. And then I was a consultant for 15 years doing work, among others, for Verra, for VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
Great, thank you very much. And Todd.
Hi, Happy to be here. My name is Todd Stevens. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society. We are a global conservation NGO working over 50 countries, and I'm the executive director of the Markets Program. And so as part of that, we're working to work with our government partners, community partners, to build a portfolio of REDD+ projects that contribute to the saving of biodiversity, but also obviously to addressing climate change, but also build a building block toward a sort of more jurisdictional future. Okay, thanks so much, and I look forward to the questions.
Great, thanks. So we have a number of questions for the panel, and we'll go through those, and then we'll hopefully leave time for Q&A from the audience. So just a reminder, if you have questions, please do share them. You can ask general questions, or you can target them to one of the panelists, and we'll get to those closer to the end. So our first question is a sort of broad question. There are an increasing number of standards and programs for REDD, and so our audience has probably heard about site-based projects, about jurisdictional approaches like JNR and ART trees, as well as other results-based payment programs like those run by the GCF. So I'm wondering if, Manuel, you could start us off by kind of giving us a high-level overview of what these are and how they fit together.
Yes, of course. Well, as a general view, I would say that, I mean, REDD in the context of the voluntary carbon markets and in the context of result-based payments started in the shape of projects among private actors, maybe some NGOs participating in the development of these projects in the 90s, early in the 90s. And these were purely voluntary and even exploratory experiences, to see to what extent it could be, I mean, carbon could be used as a means for bringing finance to protecting the forest. So the difference with the world we have today in terms of standards and programs is that, I mean, all over the 90s, we only had this type of very specific punctual transactions among a few projects and some companies or organizations and so on. For instance, you have the case in Mexico of the Escolalte project, which in, I don't know, by 1995, 97 was already selling tons of carbon to the Formula One organization, to offset the emissions from the races, for Formula One races. So the thing is, by the 2000s, when the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol have finished, and having as one of the results the exclusion of REDD from the Kyoto Protocol, the voluntary carbon market started to let's say, develop this new standard for these activities, which were not available in the UNFCCC context. So by, I know, 2007, by the time Verra was established, by then it was a verified carbon standard. Some of the first methodologies that were produced were on avoided deforestation. So with these methodologies, I mean, the carbon market in terms of REDD started growing. But at the same time, you had the still discussions on the UNFCCC after the Kyoto Protocol. Basically, discussions that started in 2008 with the Bali COP, on how to, or even 2005, with the inclusion in the agenda of incentives to reduce deforestation in developing countries. There was this expectation that finally in the UNFCCC there would be a market mechanism for avoiding deforestation. The thing is that for the following maybe 8 years, until 2013, where the Warsaw Framework was established, the negotiations under the UNFCCC created a mechanism that is at the jurisdictional level. That's basically at the level of countries or provinces as an interim measure of provinces, states, and so on, so national level. And with the particularity that this was not a market mechanism. This was a mechanism through which donor countries could pay for emission reductions achieved by programs carried out by governments. So from that point on, we have had, on the one hand, the REDD projects happening in the voluntary carbon market under standards as the BCS, maybe the American Carbon Registry, and some others. And on the other hand, these results-based payments. These results-based payments, which eventually became, for instance, the pilot project of the Green Climate Fund, as you mentioned, Bryna. And well, others, for instance, the REDD ARR Removers program from the German government, and some others. So the thing is that these two mechanisms are acting together to protect forests at different levels. And that poses an interesting challenge in the sense that the results-based mechanisms or programs do not actually, do not create a market because they do not generate units that can be traded. When one of these donor countries pays for an emission reduction, the donor country cannot sell this emission reduction to other entities or parties or whatever. It's just the recognition for this achievement, and that's it. In the case of the carbon markets, carbon credits are issued, and they can be traded in the market. So the thing is, as I was telling you, one of the challenges, interesting challenges we face now, is how to make these two systems work together. Because in the end, you have different sources of funding at different levels, and this, in the end, should result in more finance available for countries, and also hopefully in more emission reductions and faster action against climate change. So one of the challenges is basically how to ensure that these two different mechanisms and these two different levels, because we're talking about jurisdictional level and project level, act together in a way that is consistent, that is robust from the environmental integrity point of view, and that results in credible accounting, carbon accounting. So at this point, as you mentioned, Bryna, also, in the voluntary carbon market, we also have standards that allow governments, jurisdictions, to enter the voluntary carbon markets. One of them is the jurisdictional nested REDD requirements issued by Verra. The other one is R3s. So right now, what we are seeing in the market is this, countries trying to use both mechanisms at the same time to, for instance, if to get finance, for instance, trying to compensate the different features of both mechanisms. Also, for instance, if a country cannot credit emissions for a certain period of time with one of the standards because of the rules, they will try to get the money for those years or for those emission reductions achieved in those years from, for instance, the FCPF or the Green Climate Fund or bilateral agreements and so on. And what we are trying to do now with these standards and the nesting rules, let's say, nesting by nesting meaning that how you incorporate these subnational activities and project activities with the jurisdictional programs, in a way that is, as I mentioned before, consistent. So yeah, basically at the high level, that's what I would.
Great.
I would summarize it.
Yeah, thank you. So bringing it from the sort of high level, sort of theoretical level down to the ground where the forests are. I'm wondering if we could hear from some of the project developers on how you guys see projects, in particular project and jurisdictional approaches, either working together, are they mutually exclusive where you work? Where is this moving in the places you work? So Todd, I'm gonna ask you to respond on that one first.
Sure, I can be relatively quick. I think it's hard to, or maybe put this way, it's important to remember that just a few years ago, we were talking about the lack of any demand at any scale. And what we're seeing now is this question about how you harmonize these new sources of funding to try and stop deforestation. So I think the first important part for me is to cheer where we're going, because I look forward to integrating those. And I think that's really our project approach. We are really, as we support governments, you might take a place like Cambodia, and I know Brian works there as well, where the projects have created an opportunity for a real trial about how you do benefit sharing, about how government gets involved. And that has led to a nesting process that we see as going to be a way that projects support jurisdictional. That's really the way we've looked at it as we've started to scope projects around the world. In some places, you really just have all levels of preparedness at the level of government. Some places already have a lot of projects. Some places have no projects. Some people already have a sort of national system going. And we've just tried to adapt to really try and focus at a fundamental level on how do you do pay for performance to reduce deforestation or to add carbon through any kind of sequestration means in a landscape, and to do that in an equitable way. That has seemed to me to be trying to fulfill both measures of both the projects and the jurisdictional, but fundamentally about getting the people on the ground who are going to make these decisions, understanding what the consequences are and receiving payment for performance.
Great, thanks. And related to that, I want to kind of get into the role of projects specifically. So starting with Brian, and then Todd or Jenny, if you want to add in as well. What role have project-based interventions played in the places that you work? And what role do you see those playing going forward? And how do you think that the projects that you work on fit within sort of the national and local and even global goals for climate and biodiversity?
Thanks for the question. So at this point, our experience globally, working with the different communities that we work with, and as well as the different governments, we find that projects have been really important as these pilots to demonstrate first that financing can arrive and that it can meet benefits for all of the different stakeholders within each one of our projects. So some of our projects have just communities involved, such as Kenya. Our project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's on a forest concession, a former logging concession, and it's owned by the government. So we share with the government there. And then as Todd just mentioned, our project in Cambodia that we work on is all government. And so we share with the government and the communities as well. And all three of those projects, and they've been really important to demonstrate how benefits can be distributed amongst all of the stakeholders, as well as how different stakeholders can be a part of the project. So how we can support communities, how we can help them be a part of the project, what's their role in the project, as well as with governments at this point. And so as we move into this new world where jurisdictional will be important, and we plan to nest projects within the jurisdictions where we work, we see that the groundwork that we've laid through the pilot projects enables us to demonstrate how it can work at the national level as well. And so they've been critically important as the experiments for making sure that REDD+ can work with different stakeholders, and it will work at the different levels within a landscape.
Great, thanks.
Welcome.
Todd or Jenny, do you want to talk about your projects? Do you see these sort of similarly to the way that Brian described them, or are you taking a sort of different approach?
Okay, I would say that that's very much the approach we're taking. I also will say, we are a conservation organization that is going to support what the decision makers on the ground are going to do. So that means that there also could be, instances where a jurisdiction or a country is ready to go forward that way. And we're quite supportive of that. It's a longer process. The compliance is hard, but the compliance is hard at the project level as well. It just means more stakeholders. It means, greater scale and greater size. And, those are things that we would hope to support as well. But for us, the project proponent has almost always been the government and local communities. So for us, that's really no different.
I'd say from the Plant Your Future perspective, I'd echo what Brian and Todd have said. I think it's been very important to have projects. in these the last decade, because obviously that's given us amazing experience in how to implement these activities. And obviously without experience, you can't build scale. I would say when it comes to smallholder agriculture and reforestation of degraded lands, there hasn't been huge uptake of tree planting with smallholders. I think the experience we've gained is highly valuable, but there's a need to massively ratchet that up moving forward. And I think that there's still a lot of barriers to overcome in doing that. I agree with what Todd says. I mean, our perspective is the same. We obviously operate at project level currently because that was the only way we could take action. There wasn't like a jurisdictional scheme when we started working 10 years ago. We're absolutely happy to liaise with the government, work with them as and when they've got these systems in place for us to do that. But at the end of the day, we also want to make sure that the appropriate level of benefits flows to the smallholders on the ground. So certainly in Peru, there's some way off doing that for smallholder reforestation. So I think really in many ways, we'll bring our experience to them to help them scale up and kind of work in tandem on that.
Yeah, that's actually a topic I want to raise in a minute, is sort of the benefits and benefit sharing and equity. But before we get there, I'd like to ask a question about the sort of relative merits of avoided emissions, or REDD in this case, and removals, which is ARR in this case. And so we hear a lot of discussion. Some groups are advocating that we should focus more on one or more on the other. So I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on this. And to start, Manuel, maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of how the two have evolved together and kind of the relationship between the two from the sort of standards point of view.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, actually, everyone is like, or we all have the feeling that REDD has been there for too long, and that, it may be the turn for ARR to take place. No, but actually what has happened in reality is that afforestation and reforestation projects started way before REDD. No, I mean, in the voluntary carbon markets, and also in the context of the UNFCCC through the Clean Development Mechanism. No, and before we had discussions on REDD, we already had modalities and procedures for REDD for afforestation and reforestation projects in the CDM. No. The thing is, I think people have grown, let's say, bored of hearing so much about REDD. And actually, many times you hear that REDD has failed, no, because we have been discussing REDD for 15 years now, and nothing has happened, and deforestation continues to rise and so on. But the thing is, yes, the acronym has been there for 15 years, but actually REDD has not. It's just starting to be implemented at the jurisdictional level. So, I mean, responding to your question about how they both relate, in my opinion, and as a standard, what we think is that both are necessary, because if we focus imagine we focus all of our resources to afforestation and reforestation now, and we allow forests to be lost, then the emissions to the atmosphere, I mean, for an afforestation and reforestation activity, either at the jurisdictional level or at both project level, in order to achieve significant carbon stocks, it takes decades. No? So it is important to start putting some emphasis on afforestation and reforestation now, because the projects that you start now, or the activities you start now, will not bring substantive benefits in terms of climate change mitigation until the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. So it's important to plan now and to start now. But at the same time, you have to still protect the forest, because otherwise, I mean, the net result will be zero, or not what we expect. The thing is, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases from forests, and at the same time increasing the carbon stock in the forest. I mean, to achieve the Paris Agreement targets.
Yeah, I think this point about time lag and the sort of difference in time lag between the REDD projects and the ARR and what they entail is really important. So on that note, Jenny, I'm wondering whether you could sort of describe from your on the ground experiences in Peru, kind of how you see the development of ARR and the future for those kinds of projects.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is a very interesting, it's an interesting debate. In my view, just going back to the original question, in many ways, I find it quite an intellectual / hypothetical debate. Like, of course, we have to tackle deforestation and we have to tackle, restoring lands that have already been deforested, and they come together. And I see that every day with Plant Your Future. The whole, the stopping the deforestation, the reforestation are just so interlinked. It's all linked to the cycle of poverty, and it's all linked to, subsistence farming and the need for them to, for local people just to have a way to subsist. That's why they're clearing the forest. So if we can offer them alternatives of reforestation, it will also tackle the deforestation. So, in the smallholder context in the Amazon, the two really come together. So, although Plant Your Future works specifically on, carbon emission removals in terms of the carbon asset, we see it as an integrated picture. But yeah, coming to your second question about scaling up reforestation and carbon removals project. Yes, there's clearly huge potential for that. And I know there's increasing interest in that. My observation would be there's millions of smallholder farms. There's millions across the globe. There's a fact from the UN, there's 475 million small farms of under 2 hectares. Most of those farmers are not doing reforestation. It's like a tip of the iceberg. If you look on the VCS registry, there's a very small handful of projects working with those smallholders. They represent a huge opportunity in terms of climate change mitigation and maximizing benefits for corporates that want to have net zero strategies, which not only take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and help them on their journey to net zero, but also bring amazing livelihood benefits and help build resilience to climate change. However, we can't just switch it on overnight. There's a huge amount that has to be done to scale that up. So we already talked about the experiences we've had over the last decade from projects, which is really critical. I feel like it's a little bit similar in terms of getting scale in reforestation, particularly with native tree species. There's quite a few technical barriers in terms of going from the kind of scale which is occurring right now, which incidentally is really small, to the kind of scale we need. So, in Peru, the bond challenge, which the government's committed to, is to reforest something like 3.2 million hectares. Plant Your Future, my charity, is going to reforest 150 hectares next year, and we are the biggest reforestation entity in the whole of the northern half of the Peruvian Amazon. So that just, I think there's a complete disconnect in what we actually need to do and what's being done right now. And in terms of barriers, there's a real limit of native seed, that there's no native seed that's certified in the Peruvian Amazon. We've almost bought the limit that we can buy for this year. And obviously, the more deforestation you get, the less seed supply there is, particularly of endangered species, which we're so keen to bring back for the biodiversity benefits. And I think also in terms of building capacity, there's a need to build domestic technical capacity to help work with smallholders and local communities and indigenous communities to see these native trees which are planted through to thriving growth, and the fruit trees through to a kind of growth where the livelihood really improves for the local people and they actually want to carry on growing these trees, and it guarantees the whole permanence of the carbon long term. So I think that we need to be really doing far more on the ground and not expecting it just to go from the current scale to a huge scale for carbon removals overnight if we want to do it well. So we need to start seeing more funds flowing into that as soon as possible, really.
Thanks, Jenny. I want to come back to something that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is the sort of equity and governance side. So you've been talking about smallholder farmers, and also, local communities and smallholders are a big part of REDD projects as well. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about a couple of issues which we sometimes hear about, but I really want to dig into it from the project developer's point of view. So, and that's forest governance and equity on the ground with those communities. So I'm going to ask you, Todd, how do these factor into how you think about REDD and how you actually develop REDD? And if you could provide, some examples of how you see this working actually in the projects that you're working on, that would be great.
Sure. I think I'm going to pick up on what Jenny said, and I wonder if I'm just going to restate it. So Jenny, apologies. I mean, what Jenny is saying about the relationship between avoided deforestation and restoration is quite important in almost all of the sites that we work on, because a lot of the pressure comes from people needing land. People need that land to grow food, but they also need it for firewood. So if you actually, there are integrated things where restoration happens, it is a source of income, but it is also addressing a driver of deforestation. And what does that have to do with equity and forest governance? It has to do with sorting out the relationship to the actors who are making decisions. Those include government officials who are putting out land concessions. Those include government officials who are putting out money for agricultural extension. But it also includes local landholders who feel that they have a stake in the new system that you're trying to put forth, which is a system whereby they have control of land, whereby they have new sources of income, whereby they have sources of fuel wood, whereby they have a sort of inputs that allow them to move forward. So, that is a big part of sort of our work. A lot of it's in East Africa about working with smallholder farmers and understanding fundamentally what their drivers of action are and providing a response to that actually meets them where they are, meets them in the size of the farms that they have. And I just, let me close by saying that, I know you asked me about equity and governance, and I hope I answered that. The economics of those two, if you're going to ensure equity and forest governance, are really different. It takes tremendous upfront financing for restoration in a way that's not as much true for avoided deforestation. And I think as we do this, I think we really have an opportunity to show, investors and buyers of offsets what it's going to take to deliver the equity and the forest governance. And I just will be clear, it's not $3 a ton. I mean, we can have a conversation about price, but I just want to be really clear. And it's not something where you're going to get in and get out in 3 years. It's something that's going to take a sustained sort of investment and a sustained sort of presence. I think, local organizations on the ground, they can really help corporations with that, especially in jurisdictions that they're not already in. Thanks, Bryna.
Thanks, Todd. So Brian, can I actually come to you on this? So, in thinking about that the time scale to actually build those systems on the ground to deliver avoided emissions through REDD, but also to create the sort of socioeconomic conditions to keep that sustainable. You mentioned that the project in Kenya is one of the longest running, or the longest running REDD projects on the voluntary market. So if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of building that at the project level, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it like following on Todd and Jenny, I mean, this is the critical part of where we're heading, and that it takes time, right? And that's the critical piece of these projects are meant to be 30 years, and for a good reason, right? If we're going to be transforming the local economies to being low carbon economies in these places where we work, then it takes that long. And over 10 years, we are just starting to see that, right? And with the one thing I will have to say about the Kenya project, which is going to be different than most REDD Plus projects, is that the Kenya project is actually owned by local communities. So it's 35 communal ranches that were given out in the 70s, I believe it was, to these local communities. And there's thousands of stakeholders who own some of the ranches. Some of them are smaller, and there's just a few owners of them. But so the major portion of our project there is actually communally owned. There's no government involvement in that project. So it's slightly different than most projects. It's more along the lines of what I hear Jenny talking about. It's more like this kind of smallholder kind of group of people who happen to own these communal ranches. And in that case, we have great governance, right? Because we're working directly with the people who own the forest, and they live there. And what we did to create equity within the sharing is we created a community carbon trust fund, and we created local development committees that then put proposals to that trust fund, and then we share the funding in that respect. So we don't do household payments, right? We do community-wide payments. And over the years, what we've seen in these first 10 years is that the majority of the money the community wanted to give toward educating their children. So most of it went to scholarships. That's what they chose. And then we also have done support of the medical unit within the broader community, so that we did a public-private partnership there. And then we did water is important in Kenya, and so we created water catchments for the community as well. So those are the major kind of ways that the community use the money for themselves to help themselves develop. And now we're starting to see where we're able to, through that education, we're starting to see some of the children come back. And so this is where, as Jenny was talking about, the need to build capacity has come through, but it's not until 10 years later that you're finally starting to see that people be educated to come back. And so we're just starting to get to that point where we can hire more local people at more technical positions. So an example would be, we use a gyrocopter to protect our site. So it's a little over 100,000 hectares. And one of our gyrocopter pilots is now a local. So he went out, got trained, and went through high school and saw what we were doing, and then came back. I think we have one person who became a medical doctor and has come back to the community. So these are the ways in which, over time, these are really concrete examples of how that project now at this stage, we're seeing that, slowly happen. We think that that's possible for a lot of these places, but we need time. And we also need time because of the lag that was talked about between reforestation type work that happens, because we do that as well. Within our REDD Plus projects, we don't claim the credits for that, but there are places where we will do that type of work as well. And we need time for those to build in, so then we have less pressure on the forests as well. So that's another example of how we've worked with that. So I think that's...
It's really interesting. I mean, it essentially sounds like building like a really local green economy around the carbon finance. And again, any kind of economic development takes time. So that's basically what you're describing there. So the last question that we have for the panel is actually about sort of the market side. So increasingly, as the interest in REDD and ARR takes off, we're seeing more and more intermediaries and investors, brokers, retailers, platforms show up to kind of become involved and try and scale up this market. So I'm wondering what this looks like from the project, again, from the project development side. So how you guys are interacting with these investors and other intermediaries. What have your organizations, done in terms of developing partnerships with these intermediaries? Jenny, can I start with you on that question?
Yeah, certainly. I think that is a really interesting question, and one that's increasingly coming to the fore as the kind of bubble continues to grow around carbon markets. With Plant Your Future in mind, I'm not sure, like, in terms of people on the call, how clear people are on who an intermediary would be versus a project developer. So obviously, there's organizations like Plant Your Future, like small nonprofits who work directly with communities on the ground. And normally the community themselves are the right holder for the carbon. So they're the ultimate beneficiary, and the person that, if you're a corporate, that your carbon payment is essentially going to, or that's being managed with the grassroots or project developer who is working directly with those communities, be that a project developer like Wildlife Works or a nonprofit like ourselves or WCS. And then between those entities and the end buyer, there may be a number of different intermediaries. Those intermediaries might be helping partly fund some of the activities, or they might just be buying the carbon credits, or they might be helping the on-the-ground organization get their carbon credits certified. However, I think there's a really important point here about equity and benefit sharing, in that obviously there is ultimately a price that's paid for the carbon credit. So if we can just take a price, like if we can assume a price of $10 per ton, I think it is ultimately important to think about how much of that money goes back to the beneficiary and carbon right holder. And I think my reflection on that with my Plant Your Future hat on, certainly, and is to really advocate for the local communities, because obviously they are the ones doing the most work. They are the ones growing the trees, and they are the ones that we need to work with to break the cycle of poverty and to improve their livelihoods, so they can transition to this more tree-based system and guarantee the carbon permanence, and the carbon is locked away in those trees for a long time. So it is important that there is some transparency and some fairness over, if, like, of the $10 for the ton, that goes to those beneficiaries. And at the moment, I think that with the growth in the market, there is actually quite a lack of transparency and reporting on that. So I think often from my own experience in this with offers I've received from Plant Your Future, but obviously I'm quite an experienced actor in carbon finance as well, so it puts me in a slightly different position to the normal negotiator. You can be offered $2 a ton and it's going to be sold on for 10. And potentially the person who's bought it for 10 has no idea. They're hearing about the nice benefits, but maybe some of those benefits are not going to be there for the long term, because these trees simply aren't going to survive with those kinds of payments, and the right kind of on the ground activities then can't be sustained in the long term by the implementing project developer. So I would say in this equity issue and with intermediaries, I would kind of call for more transparency on that. And I would call for corporates who are the end buyer, who are going to retire the credits, to really ask the question, how much of this payment is actually going back on the ground? And to me, it's not enough for the answer just to be like, oh, it's bringing great benefits, don't worry, they've got some benefits. It needs to really be much more transparent. They're like 50% of this payment, 70% of this payment is going on the ground. And for us, maybe as an industry, to be thinking about some benchmarks of what's actually appropriate, rather than, well, it's a young industry. So I think there's some room for development in that, and perhaps others on the panel might want to comment as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I'd like to hear from Todd or Brian. Todd, you took yourself off mute, so I'm wondering whether you want to comment on this and then come to Brian.
Yeah, let me be quick because I've already spoken a lot. WCS is a large NGO, but we have really decided to work with Everland to help us market our credits. We did that because we needed an intermediary. To be honest, building a corporate engagement staff who deeply understands the ESG needs of the corporate buyers, who's on top of where pricing is going in a very illiquid market, is just expensive. And so I mean, if I look at myself and sort of the things Jenny said, I mean, Jenny's experienced, but she's not 10 people. And so it's very difficult, and I would say, so there's a role for intermediaries, but I could not agree more about the transparency. And I think in some ways that's how we chose what intermediaries to work with. And there was a time in which we were really quite disempowered in making those choices. I think that time is now radically changing, and that gives me real hope for the future. I think someday there is going to be price discovery in a liquid market, but we're not there yet, and it's very hard to know when that's going to come. So I just really appreciate Jenny's call for transparency. Brian?
Yeah, I think the benchmark comment you made, Jenny, is spot on. And so we try to have a benchmark that we look forward to and try to keep to for all of our projects, and it's approximately 60%. So when somebody does come to us, they know that, okay, 60% of the funding is going to stay in country, and then a certain portion of that will go to the communities, depending on the site. We can't, it all depends. Each project is slightly different, so we can't guarantee how much will end up in the communities after that. But the benchmark is that for us, and we do think that that's important for our industry to have. And obviously, yeah, intermediaries are critical. We started out doing everything ourselves. I kind of describe us as like the Apple of Red Plus developers. We developed the project, sold the credits, we did everything at first. And I think that enabled us to maintain the integrity of our projects and to be able to maintain that control that we needed at the beginning stages of the market. But intermediaries are critical to most, especially when it comes to smallholder type projects, because it is hard for us at the pricing that we're at to do, we would love to be doing, community forests.
It looks to me like Brian might have frozen. Are you guys seeing that as well? Should we, Todd, do you want to jump in? I think you had another thought on this.
Just really quick, just to echo the kind of thing Jenny said. Every project is going to tell you their benefit sharing. That is not what we're talking about. Benefit sharing is of net revenue after all sort of fees, issuance costs, and other things are paid. And so you should get that as a buyer, and you should demand that. You should demand some sort of understanding of how it works, how decision-making, some sort of track record about how money gets down there. But the question we have is how you get from gross revenue to net revenue. And that's really what I think Jenny is alluding to, just to be really clear about that.
Yeah, actually, we've just had a question from an audience member who is wondering why. So, why isn't this standard? Why isn't there a standardized calculation of how much communities get across, say, all REDD projects or all ARR projects or the voluntary market?
Yeah, that's a good question from Danila. I mean, it's not standardized because it's a free market. Obviously, it is possible to put in some measures. And, I have been wondering about that myself, actually, whether that is something now the market's developing more, that we could hope to see from some kind of standards agency like Verra or other standards. I think it's hard to set an actual limit or, with a different pricing and different project costs. Maybe it's difficult to set something very fixed. But I think, again, to reiterate what I said before, just transparency over it is really key. And then investors, can just, or buyers of credits can really know what's happening. And then they can make a choice on that, because I imagine most people who are buying carbon credits would like to be ensuring that, a decent percentage is going to the actual people that did the activity, and that will ensure that the carbon is locked away permanently. Otherwise, there could be reputational risk in the future because, the community feels it was swizzled.
Yeah, I think in our experience, because as Birdlife, we do have a number of projects in development as well. I think the other thing is that each project is going to have slightly different structures, and the kinds of work that you're doing with communities is going to be different. So you might have some places where community members are getting paid for specific pieces of work. You might have, as Brian was saying, sort of trust funds that get set up. You might have other kind of other mechanisms that the government recognizes as best practice for benefit sharing. So each one is going to have a different kind of structure and way of calculating. So I think it would be difficult to standardize, but I do think that your point about transparency is really important. And I see Brian has now joined us again on a different device, which is great. So we've actually hit the end of our sort of pre-prepared questions. So I have collected a couple from the audience. Actually, one audience member was asking about our actual pipelines. So I'm wondering whether maybe Todd and then Brian, you could talk about the actual number of projects or the locations of the projects that you have in development at the moment.
Sure, but I guess so, when I have to sort of present out to the people who are supporting us, I think there's 11 projects in 9 countries, but that are in development. But the real issue is they're at all stages. And I think that's one thing I sort of have to say is that, really project development takes a lot more time than you might think, because actually sort of getting stakeholders to a point where they can make decisions that the opportunity costs of foregoing deforestation or however you want to think about that matches the sort of carbon revenue takes a long time, and there's sort of a group decision making. I'll say one more thing, which is that the other issue is that WCS as an NGO doesn't have enough capital to go develop all the projects. So we are probably going to have to take private sector investment. And so we need to get the projects to be an investable proposition, but then have, as you say, an equitable, fair, but also investable proposition whereby money's injected into the project to take it from a feasibility study to actually issuing credits, and of course doing the activities that are reducing deforestation and or sort of the restoration activities. I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. Brian, if you don't mind kind of talking a little bit about your pipeline, and I know that you guys just secured a fairly large investment. So I'm curious if you could talk about how you see that investment kind of helping you deliver this pipeline.
Sure. You can hear me okay on my new device? Yeah, I don't know what happened, but anyways, my computer lost power earlier than I was expecting. So sorry that I went off unexpectedly there to everyone. Yes, we recently announced we signed an agreement with a Hartree to develop 20 million tons of emission reductions over the per year over the next 10 years. And so that agreement also comes with, it's a combined agreement in that we have development funding as well as partial sales are done for that project. So in order to make sure that the projects could operate for all 10 years, so we set up the agreement such that we have funding for that. So we can just go ahead and develop the projects and not have to worry about the initial portion of making sure that the projects will work, because that's the hard part for us in our space, right? You can develop a project, get investment money, but then who's going to purchase the credits? So we set it up so that that was already in place for 10 years. And in terms of how many projects that would be, we're still, it's very difficult to determine that. Our goal is at a minimum 10, and we're working all over. Right now, we're looking all over the world. And so we have 3 main countries we're looking at in Asia, Indonesia, India, and Cambodia at this point. And then in Africa, it's kind of spread out. Right now, we're in the Kenya and Democratic Republic of Congo. We're looking at Cameroon and I think Zimbabwe and Zambia. Those are the other 2. And then in Latin America, we are in Colombia is the main place. We're looking at Panama, and we might be looking at other countries down south. Peru we've looked at, but it's a little messy there. So we'll see where we end up after that. So that's the general kind of where we are and thinking about our pipeline and the basics of how that deal was set up, which we think is great for our space and in general for everyone. And we hope that there'll be more of these to come, because we're just one small company at this point.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so we're getting quite a few interesting questions from the audience. There's one about CCB and SD Vista standards. And I guess also given the title of this summit is includes biodiversity, it's important to think about the co-benefits and how those standards are helping to verify the co-benefits. I'm going to leave that open. Do any of you guys want to answer that question about those standards and how you use?
Sure. I'd be happy to take that really quick. We just finished our first SD Vista. So we're hoping that it was not a very easy process, but it's new. And so, anytime you first do use one of those, we do think that is a critical part of working with the projects, to have all 3, to be able to communicate with the departments for our buyers, to make sure that they have clarity on how we're meeting the SDGs. The SD Vista is really helpful in that process. And so we hope that the rest of our projects would have both VCS, CCB, as well as SD Vista, and there be an audited version of how we're meeting the SDGs.
Great, thanks. Jenny, did you want to add about that from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Angela. Yeah, I mean, I think the CCB is the absolute, market benchmark in terms of ensuring safeguards for communities and biodiversity. And it's a great tool for investors if a project's got CCB to be able to see really specifically spelt out how these different co-benefits are going to be monitored and quantified. And it also puts in some minimum requirements in terms of consultation, so you can be confident that FPIC's being followed and so on. So I think that's a really powerful tool. Yeah, and obviously the SD Vista also just helps to highlight other benefits. But I'd say the CCB is most robust in terms of ensuring safeguards. And certainly from Plant Your Future's perspective, it's just a very useful design tool for projects. I mean, many of those things we'd have done anyway, but it provides a really useful framework when you're developing a project.
Thanks. There's a question about, which relates to this idea of sort of nesting in the jurisdictional versus the project and how we harmonize the credits. And we talked a little bit about that in the beginning. But what I'd like to ask actually is, given that so many countries are actually in the process of developing their policies, could you guys talk a little bit about what that means from a project development point of view? We've talked about the time lag for getting the stakeholders on the ground involved, but could you talk a little bit about how the evolution of policy may be impacting some of the timelines? Todd, go for it.
Quickly, we would not go forward with any kind of project, nor would we really solicit investor money, nor would our country programs work if we didn't actually have government buy-in. I mean, we just wouldn't do that. And so it's not so much this sort of, opposition to policy, but it's an understanding of how this fits into the national REDD strategy. Some places are difficult when there isn't a national REDD strategy, but then it's incumbent upon you as a project developer to work with the government to figure out what you're going to do. I mean, I think there's just, at this point, that just is expected. And I think most project developers wouldn't go ahead if that wasn't the case. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't irregularities and inconsistencies and all the rest of that, but that should be plain, and you should be expecting that of your project developers to disclose that and talk to you about that.
Great. We're also getting a few questions about the sort of investment piece. So I'm wondering whether maybe if you guys want to talk a little bit more about, from an investor point of view or from a project developer point of view, what investors should be looking for and how they might engage, so we can have more sort of big investments like the Hartree investment that Brian mentioned.
And one thing I would mention, Bryna, on that is just, I think the investment structure is really quite distinct for the reforestation versus the avoided deforestation model. So, potentially those are different types of investors because of the timeframes involved and also the amount of upfront capital. And also, I think the investors for the removals projects need to be quite clear on whether they're interested in the other assets. So for example, with Plant Your Future, we've also got, there's cocoa being grown and there's timber. Obviously those are owned by the smallholders, but the way the whole investment can be structured for reforestation often isn't just premised on the carbon, because the other assets will ultimately be more valuable. So there's those things to think about. So I find often they're quite different types of investors that might be thinking about the two different types of activities.
Yeah, and from either Todd or Brian, do you look at this are you looking for investors in one project, or are you looking for investors that will invest in a number of projects or a portfolio of projects? How do you see that when you're thinking about this?
I'll go quickly. We don't have the bandwidth to go project by project. I think for us, the portfolio made sense because it's the only way we can actually scale up. I think that the important thing, though, is even though there's a portfolio, we are somewhat constrained in the sense that we're still going to have country by country investments and agreements. So while there may be a portfolio overarching, there'll be individual agreements in the countries. The other thing that's going to happen is if we're ever going to get to scale, they're going to start being much, much larger projects. How we're going to handle that, we don't know. But we are, we continue to hear from the investment community that they want larger, and we're struggling to provide that scale at any kind of pricing that looks like where we are now. So maybe something has to give, and that's price. I don't know. Or maybe we get better at our job.
I think that in terms of what we found is that the portfolio from our perspective as well was critical. Like Todd was saying, that we weren't going to move forward unless we had a portfolio approach. So that was the best way to move forward, and that's what we focused on. It's really hard to do one-off deals, which we did for years and years and years, and it's much easier to work in a portfolio approach.
Great, thank you. So we've only got a few seconds left. I want to say thank you so much to the panelists, Todd, Manuel, Jenny, Brian. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the audience for your questions and participation. We have a good rest of your day.